5 3 9 7 1 5.
Hey there. You took my line. But you just went over there. Threw me off. Hello there. Welcome to this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. I said that weird. We are your hosts. Yeah? Da.
Guten Tag.
We're going to Germany this week even, so we're right on script.
I'm getting a new stamp on my adventure passport.
Yeah, you mean you're like fake one?
Yes.
Because you haven't gone anywhere outside the United States.
I don't even have a passport. I don't even have a star on my driver's license.
I have a passport. It doesn't have any stamps in it. Don't you have to have a star if you are a pilot?
No, to travel.
Oh, period?
Yes.
Oh, I thought if it was someone that like flew commercially, as in flew the plane.
Nope. Someone who gets on the plane to ride it.
Well, I'll never need one of those. I will drive anywhere in the continental U.S.
Ain't no one got time for that. Except my daughter, who's been harassing me relentlessly to take a road trip. She's like, I don't care where, I just like driving.
Right? Her aunt's niece.
Well, we do enjoy road trips, but most of the time if I'm on vacation, I want to spend all my time on the vacation.
Nope. I like being on the road. A couple days on the vacation, lots of time on the road. Anywho, we are indeed Sarah Jones,
Samantha Carter.
And we are super happy to be finally back in the studio on a regular schedule now, hopefully. We know that things have been a little sporadic over the weird COVID summer, but honestly, we're always trying to stay on track and we'll do our best to keep bringing you guys consistent, weird and creepy stories because, well, we love to do it. And we're always happy to hear feedback from all of you listeners. Speaking of feedback, if you would like to send us any, you can do so at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com, Facebook, Instagram, or the Twitter. Even better, you can leave us a voicemail at 641-812-2635 and we'll play it on our next episode. And as usual, don't forget to push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you happen to be listening from so that you can be notified each week when we publish a new episode.
This week, we've got a super weird, very creepy, extremely sad, and even worse, completely unsolved story for you. We've always found this one to be incredibly unsettling. The story of the Hinterkaifeck murders is one that has stood the test of time, taking a small and quiet rural area by total surprise, creating suspicion among neighbors and friends as they wondered both silently and openly who among them could have executed an entire household so brutally. The simplicity of the whodunit aspect didn't even make up the biggest parts of the whispered conversations that took place around the quiet countryside. The eerie events and coincidences that occurred in the months preceding the event, along with some additional information about the victims themselves that seemed to surface afterward, made up the largest bulk of it. Different crazy details just kept emerging from this case as the investigation went on, and these details are what make the situation at Hinterkaifeck so infamous. And that's what we'll be talking about today. The Hinterkaifeck murders have baffled and unnerved many, many people in the years since they took place.
The entire thing took place in the beautiful countryside of Bavaria. This was a farming area. Quiet, calm, a small settlement named Kaifeck that sat 50 miles or so north of Munich. Everyone seemed to know each other and nothing too out of the ordinary usually happened around there. They were just simple people living simple lives.
Things out of the ordinary usually happened, then they wouldn't be out of the ordinary, would they?
I guess that's absolutely right.
Contextually.
Great observation.
Yes.
Moving on. Da?
That's Russian, isn't it?
I don't know. I'm not that cultured. Okay, anyway. People of routine predictability. A small farmstead in the area just northeast of the Kaifeck settlement housed a family of 5, and they were no exception. Fun fact, Hinterkaifeck is what the farmstead would come to be known. The prefix hinter means behind, so the name of the farmstead literally means behind Kaifeck. Andreas and Kazelia Gruber lived there in the home with their adult widowed daughter Victoria and her 2 children, Kazelia and Joseph. Actually, it's spelled Joseph. I think it's Yosef.
I have no wish to fight you. A few different things started to make neighbors and townspeople suspicious that something ominous had gone on at the Hinterkaifeck farm. First, on Sunday, April 2nd, many people noticed the absence of Victoria from church. She typically sang in the choir and was said to be one of the best singers in the area. A couple of friends showed up at the farm that morning to pick her up, as this is how she would normally get there. But she never emerged from the house, so they went on to church assuming that she wasn't coming. It wasn't normal for her to not show up to sing. The next day, Monday, Monday, April 3rd, Victoria's daughter, little 7-year-old Kazelia, was noted to be absent from school without any word as to why or any notification from her mother. The following day, Tuesday, April 4th, Kazelia didn't show up for school again. And again, no word from her mother or anyone in the family despite her absence. The same Tuesday, the mailman had also been alarmed when he noticed that no one had been gathering the mail from the family's mailbox, and it was really starting to pile up. He had told some people in town that looking through the piled up mail, it looked like it hadn't been touched since Saturday, April 1st. April Fools! Do other countries celebrate that, or is it just America?
I have no idea.
America, the land of irrelevant holidays, like International Talk Like a Pirate Day.
I have no idea why you would not like that.
I'm pretty sure International Talk Like a Pirate Day is not celebrated internationally.
Nor is it irrelevant.
Indeed. Arg. BT dubs. International Talk Like a Pirate Day occurred just recently on September 19th.
I missed it.
I didn't. Narp?
Yarp?
So, a few people supposedly had noticed the general absence of the family over the weekend and into the beginning of the week. But as far as the farm went, the animals appeared to have been tended, and smoke had been seen coming from the chimney, so people hadn't really worried too much so far.
Also, that Tuesday, April 4th, a repairman named Albert Hoffner showed up at the Hinterkaifeck farm early in the morning to work on an engine of one of the machines there. The machine was housed inside of a room in the barn, and he had been contacted by Andreas Gruber to do so. And this was their agreed upon time, but when he got there, he couldn't find anyone around. Apparently, this man knew what he was supposed to be working on, and he knew his way around because after waiting for about an hour, he went ahead and entered the engine shed on the property to start repairs on the engine. He was there for several hours, and he didn't finish working at the Hinterkaifeck farm until about 2:30 in the afternoon. Throughout his workday, the place remained unusually quiet, with the exception of the family dog's occasional bark from the house. When he finally wrapped up his work, gathered his tools, and walked out of the barn, the repairman was a little surprised to see that the dog had been tied up to a post in the yard where it had previously been in the house. But although he'd been listening for signs of people present in the home, he had heard nor seen anyone that entire day. So who could have done this? Looking around a little more, he noticed that a barn door that had been standing open upon his arrival that morning had been closed at some point while he was working on the engine. The repairman was super confused, walking around the property for a little while, calling out to see if anyone was around, but no one answered his calls, so he went ahead and packed up his tools and he left.
The Gruber's neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, had heard of the family's lack of presence in town, and he had also heard the repairman's story from that day as well, because the repairman stopped by Schlittenbauer's home to let him know that he had been to the Grubers to fix the feeder. The repairman asked Schlitten How now, brown cow? The repairman asked Schlittenbauer to let Andreas Gruber know that he had been there and that the feeder was fixed. He also told him about the somewhat strange notion that there had been someone there, but he couldn't seem to find them as he looked around, and no one ever answered his calls.
Wouldn't that creep you out to be on someone's place and all these things were happening, but no one would answer you and you didn't see anyone? It would be unsettling.
Aliens.
Yeah.
Obviously. It's aliens.
Lorenz Schlittenbauer obviously thought that this was odd, and he was thinking that someone should go down to the Gruber farm, so he had 2 teenage boys, and he asked them to go down to Hinterkaifeck to check up on the Grubers to make sure that everything was okay.
I find that when there's a possibly dangerous, suspicious situation, that sending the children first is always the best option.
I mean, send the kids.
Send the children.
And then if they don't come back, then you call the cops.
Yeah.
Right?
From a great distance.
Yeah, you don't go down there and call the cops. You just stay at your house and you're like, my children also didn't return.
It's like how the firemen call the cops the Blue Canaries. You know,
yeah.
You send the firemen in, or you send the cops in first, and if they don't come out, the firemen don't go in.
I know from experience, ambulance drivers also call them the Blue Canaries. The boys went down to the farm to have a look around. Like the repairman, they walked around the place calling out, but they also received no answer. Now at this point, no one really knows if anything is actually wrong. They've just noticed their lack of presence. The family could be sick or out of town or anything, really. I doubt these people who had been to the farm looking for them were actually going all the way into the house and the barns to search. I know that if it was me, I wouldn't go around opening doors and entering buildings on their property at this point. So my guess is that this is just kind of a light search and scan of the property to see what they could see. And they saw and heard Absolutely nothing.
Niet.
The same weird and unsettling silence that the repairman had heard earlier that day. The boys went back to their father, Lorenz, and they told him that no one was home.
Lorenz was not satisfied with this, though. He was really becoming concerned that something didn't seem right. So he talked to a few of the other neighbors, 2 men named Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. The 3 men decided to go down to the Hinterkaifeck farm and actually search for anyone in the family. Now, it looks like from the photos that the house and the barn are actually one long angled building, and it's all connected. The living quarters on one side and the barn on the other. If you were to walk up to the house through the courtyard, there is a big front door, and this is the main door to the house. There is actually another entry door to the house from the outside, but from what we read, it wasn't really a usable door because an apparent plumbing mishap caused the family to create somewhat of a quick fix, and some of the water pipes ran across the entryway and blocked the door from opening. This really doesn't matter though at the time because the men weren't able to get inside the living quarters because both of the doors were locked.
However, walking around the house to the barn area of the building, the 3 neighbors were able to enter the building through one of those doors.
So was there a door that connected the barn to the house? Because that would make winter chores a breeze.
Yes, there was.
Okay.
We'll get to that later because I give a better description of this. But yeah, actually,
Okay.
it all runs together.
I'm just trying to, paint the picture here.
Yeah, and it's actually applicable later. That question.
Okay.
It makes sense. As the men were walking through the barn, the first man in line tripped over a large wooden door that had been laying on top of what appeared to be a pile of hay. As the first man fell, the second man's foot hit the door, tripping him as well, and slightly moving the door.
It sounds like us trying to walk into a room, like any room.
On a flat ground.
Yeah.
We're just
walking
falling.
down a hallway.
Yeah.
Or an empty parking lot,
So as the second man's foot hit the door, he tripped and it slightly moved the door over. The movement of the door caused the third man, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, to notice something very, very bad. The movement of the door as it slid slightly on top of the pile of hay revealed a human foot.
Ignore that. That's not what I was trying to do. A human foot.
Yeah.
Okay. A human foot.
So underneath the door, there was a human foot.
We established that.
So horrified, obviously, 2 of the men hurried to slide the door even more as Schlittenbauer pulled on the leg, sliding the person out from its makeshift hiding place. The first person found was 63-year-old Andreas Gruber, and he was definitely deceased. At this point, the 3 men picked up the door, completely removing it from the top of the pile of hay, and this revealed 3 more members of the family. 72-year-old Kazelia Gruber, Andreas and Kazelia's daughter, 35-year-old Victoria Gabriel, and her young 7-year-old daughter, Kazelia Gabriel, all lay lifelessly piled on top of one another, soaked in each other's blood with a layer of hay between each of the bodies. It was horrific.
We say that it was horrific because it truly was. And not just because they had found the bodies of these 4 people. The manner in which this family died was absolutely gruesome and probably very hard to see. Andreas Gruber was said to be almost unrecognizable, with his face being completely collapsed, with the exception of a few sharp protruding bones. The other family members were pretty much in the same shape, having been killed by obvious blunt force trauma and little Kazelia clutching tufts of her own hair. It was a huge, devastating mess.
So now they know why the family has been so notably absent from the normal day-to-day lives in town. At this point, Victoria's young infant son, Josef, had not been found, and the men were thinking that maybe the boy was still alive somewhere on the property, likely in the house. So they went back to the house to try to find a way to get in. Looking around, they noticed a smaller door that led to the feeding stalls. In the feeding stall area, there was another door leading to the kitchen of the house, and the men were able to enter the residence this way. Hurrying into the bedroom of Victoria Gabriel, they did find the young boy, but it was too late. He too had passed in the same way that his family had met their ends. Someone had come into the room and hit the infant boy in the head with a weapon, killing him in his crib. Afterwards, whoever killed the boy grabbed one of the mother's skirts and used it to cover up the boy and what they had done to him.
So trying to hide or conceal the corpses shows remorse, yes?
I mean, kinda. We discussed that later too. I mean, yeah, it does, but
I've been watching Criminal Minds with my cats again. I told my daughter the other day that I was canceling our Netflix, and she says, "How will we watch Criminal Minds?" And I said, "Damn, we can't cancel Netflix." Well played. As the men continued,
Wait, stop.
because I said as.
Jeez. Calm down.
No. As the men continued to walk around inside the residence, however, they were surprised to find yet a sixth body in another small bedroom that sat directly behind the bedroom of Andreas and Kazalia Gruber. This was a woman that none of them seemed to know, and none of them seemed to know why she would be there, because it was well known that the maid who had been working for the Grubers for years had quit and moved out about 6 months prior to this day. So who was this woman? Well, it turns out, in a cruel twist of fate, a new maid had been hired to work at the Gruber home. Her name was Maria Baumgartner, and she had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just the previous Friday, which was thought to be the very day that the family was murdered. So this poor woman had only been at the farm likely hours before she was killed. Worst timing ever. Maria's sister traveled with her to the Gruber's farm to meet the family and stayed for a short time, enjoying a meal with them before she bid Maria farewell and left for home. The sister of Maria Baumgartner was likely the very last person to have seen the family alive. Highly suspicious. Maybe Maria was escaping an abusive boyfriend.
Why would you say that?
Then he followed her and killed the whole family.
Ooh. Yeah, that's not even a theory that was introduced.
Hi, my name's Sam. I'm really good at theories.
Keyboard investigator. Armchair detective. That's what they're called.
Keyboard investigator. Armchair detective. And my chair does in fact have arms.
It does. You're right on track. I don't know why we don't get hired more. So at this point, one of the men was sent to town to alert the local police of what they had found at the Gruber farm. We found a few different sources that stated that it took the police a few days to show up and investigate the crime scene, but the local newspaper had an article that stated that the first investigation actually took place that night on Tuesday, April 4th, and was conducted by the investigating judge of the Schrobenhausen District Court, John Weisner. So we're not really sure actually how much time passed between the reporting of the crime and when the police actually showed up to the scene, but it was said that during this time period, word around town spread like wildfire, and people from the area who had heard about the murders began flocking to the Gruber farm to see what was going on for themselves.
I really don't understand this mentality.
Well, I don't either.
Let's go see the dead body.
I know. I would not.
People that you know.
Yeah, I don't know. Random people were walking around the house, the farm, the barn, making snacks in the kitchen, all kinds of things. So, of course, when the police finally did arrive to the farm, they had an extremely disturbed and contaminated crime scene to deal with.
Isn't that what happened at Velisca, too?
Yeah.
They took pieces of their skulls.
Yeah. They were like taking souvenirs.
Yeah, from the body.
Those people who took pieces of the bodies should be the first suspects.
Well, and you know that it's most likely that while all those people were milling around, the suspect always returns to the scene.
Yeah, if they're a serial killer especially.
And then.
What else you got, armchair?
Give me a second.
Okay, moving on.
A second investigation took place on the next day, in the daylight, and was conducted by Weisner again, along with the representative of the public prosecutor's office, Theodor Hensel. On April 5th, yet a third investigation was conducted by the police department from Munich as well. It was said that the chief inspector from the Munich police department, George Reingruber, expressed of the crime scene, quote, "I have never seen such a horrible sight." And by the time he saw it, there had been a public tour and snacks and all
probably
the things.
Like admission charge and all kinds of stuff. What the hell?
Popcorn.
Yeah, jacked up. So the regional court physician from Newburgh actually performed the autopsies on site in the front yard.
Probably with an audience.
Yeah, which means Dr. Johann Baptiste Melier examined the bodies and cut them open right there at the farm on a makeshift table in the front yard of the property. This took place on April 7th, but the sources that we found never really directly referenced the autopsy report as much as they referenced wounds and the possible murder weapon from the investigator's report. So we're not sure if the autopsy report just wasn't made public, but the investigator seemed to have direct knowledge of what was in it. So that's where the information regarding the condition of the bodies, the murder, and the murder weapon seemed to come from.
So bear in mind, this is a week after murders are thought to have occurred.
Yeah, but this happened on the 7th and they weren't even found till the 4th. So it's technically 3 days after they were found.
But a week after,
Yeah.
for autopsy's sake, a week after they died.
Yeah.
And they had not been anywhere off the property, so they were probably in pretty poor condition.
Mm-hmm. Likely so. The references made in the initial reports regarding a murder weapon seem to be total speculation, because for a very long time, the murder weapon wasn't found. They didn't really know for sure what the killer used, but this was a farm after all, with a great number of potential objects that would have done the job. We read that many of the wounds appeared to be star-shaped, and we do know that for one reason or another, Dr. Amelia decapitated each one of the bodies and sent the heads of each victim away for what was reported as, quote, specialist examination. From what I can understand, this specialist was actually a psychic who performed somewhat of a clairvoyant examination. They wanted her to see what information she could gather from the heads, if any. It sounds like she didn't really pick up any psychic information from this, and she was ultimately of no help. From there, it sounds like the heads of the victim were sent on to the prosecutor's office in Munich, where the rest of the evidence, which was very little, was being stored.
It was determined that blunt force trauma seemed to be the cause of death for each one, because it was very obvious that they had all been hit in the head and face with something. Additionally, though, for Victoria and her mother Cazelia, strangulation was also a factor. So what does this mean? Was there more than one killer? Different methods of death may suggest that. Were the murders of Cazelia and Victoria more personal to the killer? Or maybe the killing of these two didn't happen as easily as it did with the others. Maybe hitting them didn't do the job, and they fought back and he strangled them to finish up the job, but not the maid. She wasn't strangled.
She was just hit. I think it said that she was hit the fewest times, maybe twice, and then she died slumped over in her chair. The most devastating part of this story, though, is that 7-year-old Cazelia didn't appear to have died right away, and it seems that she was left bleeding in the pile of her deceased family members. Remember how we said that clumps of her own hair were found clutched in her hands? Investigators believe that she may have still been alive for quite a while after the others died. Maybe the killer thought that the blows to her head killed her and she woke up later. It was believed that she laid there pulling out chunks of her own hair out of sheer grief, anxiety, physiological shock, or even total confusion over what was happening to her and her family, and she was likely in a daze from the blows inflicted upon her by this person who had been hiding in the barn.
But that's not all. The murder itself was absolutely horrific, but there are so many strange facts that surround this case. It sounds like the first investigation kind of just wrote the whole thing off as a burglary type situation by a drifter that had maybe gone wrong. But the weird thing about that is that it looked as though absolutely nothing was taken. It said that the house didn't even look like it had been searched or gone through at all, as it usually does when someone is rifling through things looking for money or valuables. The only thing that did look like it was searched was a small cupboard in Victoria's room, but lots of valuable things in the cupboard were left untouched. Gold coins, silver coins, 2 rings, a pair of gold earrings, 2 wedding rings, 1 silver watch, a silver women's watch, and a fur stole. I thought it to be a little weird that it was only Victoria's things that appear to have been rifled through, because I read in an archived article for the Danube Courier that shortly before the murders, Victoria was approached by a pastor who had discovered that she had hidden 700 gold marks in the confessional at her church, and she reacted very nervously when asked about it. So I wonder how that would be connected and why her things seem to have been more disturbed than everyone else's. Throughout the house, there was other money and valuables lying around as well that the killer didn't take. So she was involved in a heist. Or how did her husband die?
We'll get there.
Obviously, I haven't read this story yet. I'm intrigued.
I'm glad you're interested. Typically, one of us does the research one week and the other person is somewhat surprised by all the details, which is good, I think.
I've got my armchairs ready. My chair arms are ready.
Maybe you'll be able to solve this.
I'm going to solve this. I mean, I'm already, on track.
Indeed. Okay, so obviously burglary wasn't the motive for killing this entire family in such a horrific manner. But the theory that the murders were carried out by a drifter or by someone who was more likely not native to the area stuck. And the reason why people thought this is actually one of the creepiest and weirdest parts of the whole thing. There was a lack of food in the kitchen upon discovery of the murders and evidence that someone had recently eaten in the kitchen. The fire had been lit, the animals on the farm, including the small family dog, appeared to have been taken care of, and the cows had been milked over the weekend. And
they stayed in the house with the corpses for a week.
The people in town reported having seen smoke coming from the chimney over the weekend as well. Reasonably, these things led investigators to firmly believe that someone, presumably the murderer, had actually resided in the house for days after the murder, probably up until the discovery of the bodies. Because remember that day that the repairman seemed to believe that someone else was there while he was there, despite no one answering him when he called out. It was reported that it appeared the killer made himself right at home in the house in the days after the family and their maid were murdered, almost like he was playing house while the others lie dead in the house in the barn. So that guy, the murderer, was probably there while the repairman was doing his thing.
Yeah.
How creepy is that?
You could have been next.
He's lucky he didn't get whacked in the head while he was working.
So our next question was, how did this killer manage to get all of the family members out to the barn and kill each one of them? There was no evidence that anyone had been restrained. From the evidence, it appeared that all of them, with the exception of little Josef and Maria Baumgartner, had been killed in the barn and not in the house, and that each one had gone to the barn willingly on their own. It's believed that the killer somehow lured each person one by one out to the barn. Or maybe he said, "Come with me or I'll kill the baby," and then he killed the baby anyway.
Don't know.
Who knows? The reports make it seem as though there didn't appear to be a fight of any sort. Literally like the family walked out one at a time, as if in a trance, to the barn to be struck in the head. The killer would have a minute to stack them nicely on top of the previous family member before the next one came out. So was this someone that they knew? Was this someone that they would have trusted? Someone that they wouldn't have questioned following? This might be. But then, some investigators didn't even think that it was someone local. The long stay at the house by the killer after the murders, in which all of the farm work was being done, a fire was being built, and the place was being taken care of, suggests that they actually spent the whole time there. If it was someone local to the area, they likely would have been missed for that period of time or been seen in the area and recognized.
Initially, it is said that the case got started on the wrong foot with the initial investigators, immediately dismissing the case as a burglary, even though all of that cash and so many valuables were left alone inside the home, along with the tools from Andreas's shed. The main investigator on this case, a man named Ryan Gruber, he didn't really seem convinced that this was so. Either way, the initial arrival of the neighbors and the looky-loos carelessly walking around the scene, and the first officers to show up dismissing the case as a robbery gone wrong so quickly, led to significant hampering of evidence as well as total negligence in even collecting it. Ryan Gruber, however, would end up questioning over 100 people trying to gain enough information for an arrest, or at least for a solid suspect, but this would never come. Ryan Gruber would end up obsessed with the Hinterkaifeck murders. It was said that the killings completely haunted him, especially those of the children. He didn't leave too many people out. He questioned vagrants in the area, people had been traveling through, local teenagers, the postman, and many, many others.
When it came to suspects, there didn't seem to be much of a shortage. It turns out that the Gruber family, especially Andreas, wasn't exactly a well-liked or well-respected family in the area. Why? Tell me more, tell me more.
Yeah.
The Hinterkaifeck farm had actually belonged to Andreas Gruber's wife, Kazelia, who inherited it after the death of her first husband. Is it Josef? Joseph Assam. This had been a farm belonging to Joseph's family before him. About a year after her husband's passing, Kazelia married Andreas and the couple had Victoria. I could only find information that Victoria was their only child, but a few different sources reported that Andreas and Kazelia actually did have other children, but that Victoria was the only surviving one. Andreas was reported to be extremely abusive, and some of the articles kind of alluded to the fact that possibly this is why his other children hadn't survived. No source actually said that this was because of Andreas for sure. If you think about it, in the 20s, death rates for infants and children were much higher than they are today due to illness as well, so it's really hard to say. The family was referred to several times as somewhat reclusive, and Andreas didn't sound like an outwardly friendly guy. The only one of them who seemed social in any aspect was Victoria, who seemed to have a few friends in town and sang in the church.
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. 'em. Thanks for listening.
It seems that one of the very first people to be suspected in the killings was their very own neighbor and one of the very men who discovered the bodies days after the murder, Lorenz Schlittenbauer. It turns out that Schlittenbauer's wife had passed away and that after this, he actually had somewhat of a relationship with Andreas's daughter Victoria. He admitted having slept with her 4 to 5 times in the past. I don't know. Remember, Victoria was a widow. Her husband had served in the war and he was killed, so she had moved back home to live with her parents. A few years later, her son Josef was born and the town was abuzz that it was Lorenz Schlittenbauer's baby. Schlittenbauer was said to be in love with Victoria and had requested to marry her, but he was refused even after she had this baby that they claimed belonged to him. One article written for The World in 1997 by Martin Lambeck stated that after the death of Victoria's husband and after she moved back home, Andreas made a public statement in which he said, quote, "My daughter doesn't need a man anymore. I'm there for that." Apparently, Andreas and Victoria had gone to Schlittenbauer after the birth of Josef, telling him that Josef was his child as well and demanded financial assistance from him for the baby. Schlittenbauer initially accepted paternity of the child and believed young Josef to be his, and that was that.
Later, though, it would seem that a pretty decent motive for Schlittenbauer to kill the family would actually arise. It was well known throughout the area that Andreas and Victoria Gruber had been previously charged and jailed a few years before this, almost right after her husband died and she moved home. They were both thrown in jail for having an illegal incestuous relationship. It seems that Lorenz Schlittenbauer had reason to believe that the incest was in fact still going on between Andreas and his daughter because he ended up later denying that he was the father of Victoria's child Josef and went on to accuse Andreas Gruber of fathering the child born to his daughter.
And they found out later that he was the father, Andreas.
You are the father.
Yep. I don't know if Maury was involved in that. I doubt it.
Lie detector test determines that's probably true.
Remember, it seemed like Schlittenbauer was in love with Victoria and had been trying pretty hard to marry her despite refusal from her father. So who knows how this would have made him feel. Not only were his feelings at play here, but also the fact that Victoria and Andreas had been taking money from him for this child that they likely knew was probably not even his. In one report, it was stated that the demeanor of Lorenz Schlittenbauer upon discovery of the bodies also disturbed the other men who were with him. It seems that they thought he seemed a little too uncaring or callous when uncovering the victims and digging them out of the hay under the door. This behavior obviously made him look suspicious, especially in combination with the obvious motives that he would have had to commit the crime. One could speculate. One could surmise that he was likely the killer, and this might be pretty reasonable, but it's hard to say how a person would react in this situation. Sometimes the pure shock of what a person is witnessing makes them act strangely, and everyone deals with things like this differently. Some people take it for what it is and deal with the task at hand, and some people get really emotional and don't handle a stressful situation well. Obviously, we are not defending him or saying that he is or isn't guilty. It's just always seemed like a reach to call someone's reaction to a stressful situation evidence.
When Schlittenbauer was questioned by investigator Ryan Gruber, he told him of some really strange things that had been going on in the weeks leading up to the murders. These were things that Schlittenbauer claimed Andreas Gruber had spoken to him about. Apparently one morning, Andreas woke early before the rest of his family, and when he opened his front door on that cold, blustery morning, he was taken aback to see that there were distinct footprints in the snow on his property, but no one had been out there. Everyone else was asleep. The footprints took him by surprise because they weren't really normal due to the fact that they appeared to come straight out of the forest, walking toward the Gruber house and stop directly in front of their front door. What's even more disturbing out of these footprints is that they were the only set. Despite checking every single door and window around the home, there were no footprints leading away from the house. It's reported that Andreas followed the tracks in an attempt to see where they had started, but they appeared to literally start right at the forest's edge. This really bothered Andreas, as it freaking should, and he ended up making himself crazy searching the entire house for an intruder, but never did find anyone in the house who wasn't supposed to be there.
Even if I didn't find somebody, I would be going crazy.
Yeah.
Where are they?
Where are you?
Schlittenbauer also told the investigator that Andreas had been hearing strange noises in the attic. Noises that were very distinct and loud, making Andreas think that someone was up there. But when he would go and have a look around, he would always find absolutely no one.
Now, those little tidbits of him
Meow.
Those little tidbits of information seemed at first to only come from Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who told the investigator about it as he was being questioned as a suspect in the murder. So who knows if he's telling the police these things just because he wanted to lead them astray, or if Andreas had really confided these things to Schlittenbauer prior to the murders. But according to some sources, it seemed that an iron worker in town reported having heard these things from Andreas as well. Schlittenbauer also told police that the day before the murders, as Andreas was talking about the strange goings-on around the farm, he offered Andreas a firearm, but Andreas declined this offer and said, "I'll take care of it."
It's unclear who this next bit of information comes from, but at one point, shortly before the murders, Andreas had found a weird newspaper in his house from Munich as well. This really doesn't sound like it would be a big deal, but after finding the footprints in the snow, it kind of freaked out the family because it didn't belong to any of them. No one had visited the farm and they didn't even subscribe to this paper.
Around the same time that the newspaper had been found in the house, the family experienced an incident in which they could not find Victoria's young daughter, 7-year-old Kazelia. It was dark outside and the family spent almost the entire night looking for her. This was apparently reported by Kazelia's teacher. Apparently, the child had been found located sometime in the night in the woods across the field from the house, which they called Witch's Wood. The young girl was reportedly very confused upon being found and wasn't really able to tell the family why she had been out in the woods in the first place.
It was reported as well that the very day before the murders occurred, Andreas had gone out to do the chores when he found that someone had tampered with the lock on his shed, obviously trying to get in. The door and the lock had been severely damaged, and it appeared that someone took an axe or a large tool of some sort and had been hitting the lock of the door in an attempt to open it. Not only this, but the house keys had also gone missing from the house. Andreas was said to be extremely disturbed by this, especially after everything else that had been going on.
Why? Is there a movie about this? Because there should be.
I think there's a couple of them, but one of them is in German. I don't know. I think there was another one loosely based on it that was American.
I'm going to watch the German one and make somebody that I know interpret the entire movie for me.
There you go. That sounds awful.
It does sound awful. Initially, we thought that if Schlittenbauer was guilty of murdering the family, it would be reasonable to think that none of what he told investigators about the family's weird experiences leading up to the murders were likely even true, because he might be attempting to thwart the investigation or divert the attention of the investigators in another direction, and Andreas Gruber never reported any of these happenings to the police. Whew, that was a long run-on sentence. But they also interviewed the Gruber family's previous maid, the one who had quit and left the farm 6 months earlier. Her name was Crescence Reiger. She testified that she had walked into the barn and witnessed Andres and Victoria engaged in sexual activity, as well as overhearing multiple conversations within the household to lead her to definitely believe that this sexual relationship was going on. She also testified that while it wasn't the most pleasant place to live and work, there were some other things that occurred making her want to leave the farm for good. The maid, Crescence, was in the house alone a lot of the day, and she was getting some pretty weird vibes. She reported things frequently being moved around within the house when there was no one else there, hearing strange, definitive tapping noises coming from the walls and from the attic, as well as hearing frequent voices and footsteps coming from the attic also. She would go up to investigate and find absolutely no one. She also reported constantly feeling as if she was being watched. She seemed to be extremely unsettled by these things and cited her reason for leaving the job and moving off the farm as being, quote, its tense atmosphere and, quote, something haunts there. She was done with it.
So this house was set up kind of strangely, and we'll do our best to give it a quick description before we get to the next part because it's important. Like we said earlier, the house and the barn all seem to be one building. There were various other outbuildings in the sheds scattered around the property as well, but everything really important seems to be within this one main building. On the far side of the long building was the living quarters, where the kitchen and all of the bedrooms sat. There was a door that led from the kitchen into the barn, but also it sounds like the attic was connected to both parts of the building. One could go up some stairs from the living quarters to the attic, and then there was a doorway with some stairs in the attic that led down into the barn area. We read some reports that investigators did seem to think that someone had been hanging out in the attic, possibly watching the family, maybe for days leading up to the murders. We never could really find what evidence that they had of this specifically, but they must have noticed something that made them think so.
We were surprised to read reports of speculation. No one as surprised as I am.
Sam is just learning too.
Reports of speculation that Victoria's husband was actually someone who had been brought up several times as being a suspect. Remember, we said she was a widow. It sounds like everyone referred to her in this manner because her husband was thought to have been struck by a mine in World War I while he was fighting at war in December of 1914, within the same year of their marriage. Victoria was pregnant with their daughter Cazalia when he was killed, and she gave birth about a month after her husband's death. But in the end, Carl's body was never recovered at all, and buzz around the area was that he had not died at all but went on living under the identity of one of his fallen comrades. Only about 4 months after this is when Victoria and her father were both sent to jail for their illegal incestuous relationship. Victoria served about a month and Andreas a year, and then there were rumors that 2-year-old Josef, who was born in 1919, was Andreas' baby, so the sexual relationship between father and daughter was obviously still going on way after they served their jail sentences. So investigators thought that maybe this incestuous affair was enough for him to show up and take out the entire family. He didn't want to deal with the blood shaming that had occurred in his absence, and he was ashamed of it once he discovered that it was happening. Blood shaming was a term used when referring to incest. Some people in the area were absolutely convinced that this was the case, while others argued that Karl Gabriel had been officially declared killed at war. But like we said earlier, his body was never found, and apparently there are several records of German people going MIA during World War I, being declared dead and then showing up later on. We don't really know the details of all the speculation, or even if there was any solid reason to think that Karl would be the killer, but it seems kind of far-fetched. There was really no basis to this talk of Karl being alive other than mere rumor and speculation. It is a good sound theory, though.
I mean, yeah. It does. It is. A German newspaper record from 1922 stated that there was actually yet another couple of local suspects taken into custody. The article reads, quote, "Despite extensive investigations, the perpetrators on April 1st at 4:30 p.m, the perpetrators have not yet been identified. There may be a perception of the act that a cyclist has made. On April 1st at 4:30 p.m, that is, on the night of the crime, on the district road from Brunnen to Schrobenhausen, 2 young boys, about 20 to 23 years old, met, who were very frightened when he approached. One of them even lay down in the ditch and held his cap in front of his face. The second also turned to the side so that the cyclist could not see his face. One of the boys is about 1.7 meters tall, was wearing a dark brown suit, long trousers, a beanie, and was without luggage. The second one was about 1.65 meters tall, covered, wore a brown-gray hat, and was without coat and was believed to be carrying a backpack. It can be insinuated from the shy behavior of the two that they did not have a good conscience. On April 11th, a young man came into the kitchen of the restaurant in Ginkhofen, Heinsbach, near Geilshoring. I have no idea. What? Geiseloring. And he bought cigarettes. He asked if the Greens were in the restaurant, and then he made a remark that he had not come to be caught today. He then walked away through a rear door, although he had been assured that no police body was present.
Did they wear green uniforms? Is that the question?
I don't know.
Are the Greens in, are there any cops here? Is that?
I'm going to be honest right now, and I thought he was asking about a family.
Okay.
By the last name Green.
Okay.
But that's a really good observation. Maybe that is true, because they could be in green uniforms, and that's what they called them.
It's all in the armchairs.
Right? You're good at this, Sam.
Anyway.
It's your calling.
Well, it was for a while.
For a minute. Well, you weren't a detective. Maybe you should have went that way.
Those opportunities didn't exist.
Indeed. This guy was about 23 years old, 1.68 meters tall, blonde, brown, or yellowish cap, gray military suit, and he lacked the middle teeth on his upper jaw. He speaks a lower Bavarian dialect. End quote.
Later newspaper accounts indicate that these boys were later arrested, questioned, and subsequently released, as there was absolutely no evidence to hold them in jail other than a couple of witnesses. We are guessing that someone must have vouched for them at some point, or they were able to provide a decent alibi for the time that the crime was actually thought to have occurred. It's hard to say what they were up to, though.
We read an article written in 1951 in which a local priest was interviewed regarding a deathbed confession. A woman was dying in Augsburg and was in a great deal of emotional distress because she had something to tell her priest. The priest made sure to tell the interviewer that this was a deathbed statement and it was not made under the seal of confession. The woman told him that her two brothers had confided in her and in their parents that they were the ones who had killed the Gruber family. When asked by their family why they did this, they cited that robbery was their only motive and that they had gotten away with a lot of money, which could be because although a lot of money and valuables were found on the property after the killing, it's impossible to say how much was there in the first place. So maybe this is true.
Especially since Victoria had stashed all those marks.
Exactly. Although one would think that they would just take all of it, the woman sounded extremely distressed as though this secret had been eating at her for a very long time. This article wasn't really clear whether her brothers were just some men who were never suspected or if she was the sister of the two boys who were questioned, but it seems reasonable to think so.
The interviewer asked the priest whether he had ever reported this information to the police, since the admission was not under the seal of confession, and the priest responded, quote, "Why should I stir up dust again after decades?" End quote. He said in response to a question, quote, "Even if the killers are not known, no one is disadvantaged. If I were to speak today, there would certainly be people who did not believe me that I had learned my knowledge outside the seal of confession and who were able to shake the confidence of Catholics in the confessor. I would only do our job harm." End quote.
So there's that. There was even talk about the murders at Hinterkaifeck being political. Come to find out, Andreas Gruber was a Nazi sympathizer among a strongly liberal community who were definitely not Nazi sympathizers. Gruber didn't seem to be shy about straight up telling people how he felt and often was extremely abrasive, rubbing a lot of people the wrong way.
Wangen?
Vangen.
The nearby small town of Vangen. Get this party Vangen. The nearby small town of Vangen
is the new fetch.
Stop trying to make Vangen happen. It's never gonna happen. The nearby small town of Vangen was just getting ready to vote in their local elections, and it seemed that there were candidates of varying extremism to choose from here, with Andreas being pretty vocal about the one who was most Nazi-ish. Not wanting to see a Nazi extremist candidate win the election, and not appreciating Gruber's outspoken support of him, coincidentally, a man named Adolf Gump became a suspect in the Hinterkaifeck killings. Adolf Gump was affiliated and active within a group called the Freikorps Oberland.
Every time you imitate a German person, they sound pissed.
Oh.
Like one of those angry German women.
When I'm imitating Germans, I'm basically mimicking
the Austin Powers yelling lady.
No.
No. Or like the other German
the
lady
band
from
Rammstein.
Or like the other German lady.
Freikorps Oberland. This group was initially designed to root out communists and Polish insurgents, but then many of the members ended up turning their attention to stopping the Nazi agenda. Nazis.
Sounds like something I could get involved in.
I would have been my scalps. Sorry.
I would have been a Freikorps person. I mean, if they'd have let me, because in the 1920s, women couldn't do shit. They probably would have turned me away.
Probably true.
Mm-hmm. Anyway.
Since Gump was a local and had a vested interest and hatred for the Nazis, and Andreas Gruber so openly supported them, it was said that he may have been the one to murder the family, but despite his efforts, investigator Ryan Gruber was never able to locate him, which makes it even more suspicious.
Yeah.
Suspicious.
Another rumor was that the Nazis themselves killed the family in order to take over their farm as a hideout. Now, before you scoff at this story...
When somebody says scoff, that's all I can think of. That's scoffing?
Yeah, sure.
What is a scoff? Exactly.
I just assume it being like a...
Oh.
That's much more simple.
It's a lot less dramatic.
Okay.
Preposterous.
Your scoffing version is more interesting.
It does sound like I'm like a member of Her Majesty's Royal Navy, though.
So, it wasn't unusual during this time for Nazi hideouts to be a thing all over Germany, even in the more remote areas and in Bavaria. The Nazis, of course, were very well known for being extremely merciless, and likely would have killed the entire family, even the children, without any remorse or second thought whatsoever. The people who believe that there is evidence of more than one killer often believe this theory. The fact that it seems that the home was occupied for a couple of days after the murders helps this theory make sense as well.
But it seems so weird that they left the maid and the baby in the house.
I don't know.
Doesn't it? Wouldn't you throw them all out?
I don't think it was the Nazis, in my opinion.
I agree.
This is just one of the rumors around people speculating.
There was also a man named Joseph Bartle in the area at the time of the Hinterkaifeck murders. There are many people.
You just run the words all together. They just believe.
Hey, you guys.
Ruth.
There are many people who believe that he was likely not responsible for the murders, but highly capable of carrying them out as well. Bartle had escaped from a mental health facility local to the area in 1921 and carried significant mental illness. You always blame it on the crazies.
It's so cliche. They all escaped from a mental health hospital.
Right? A German newspaper article was written about the search for Bartle, in which they claimed that he was considered to be the perpetrator or co-participant in the six-fold robbery murder in Hinterkaifeck. They described him as a notorious murderer and criminal in the vicinity who swindled out paper money for people to stamp.
He was a counterfeiter as well.
Wow. And a marriage broker.
I don't know what that is. How do you become a marriage broker? Do people pay over there to get married and he's just pretending to wed the people? She's just staring at me. We're both unsure, I think.
I doesn't know.
Anyway,
it also states that, quote, one tends to think that Bartle is not insane, but a sophisticated and violent simulant.
Speaking of things we don't know, I got various text messages about my last mishap on the Rendlesham episode about me thinking that a Geiger counter is for earthquakes. It is definitely not. I Googled it afterwards, and so many people text me and they're like, you're an idiot.
Seriously?
Yeah, well, Jared did.
You are not smart.
I thought it was for measuring earthquakes, right? I still feel like that's true. And he's like, it's the Richter scale, which I get that. The measurements are on the scale.
Hey, Siri. Do you use a Geiger counter to measure earthquakes?
No, you moron.
Do you use a Geiger counter to measure earthquakes?
Here's what I found.
Says, no, you're dumb.
I have no idea why I thought that.
Geiger counters are used to detect radioactive emissions.
Yeah.
Most commonly beta.
Yeah, I don't know.
The one application where Geiger tubes are still in use today is in borehole gamma something.
Yeah, I don't know. Not earthquakes, right?
Hey Siri, How do you measure earthquakes?
Here's what I found from encyclopedia.com. To determine the magnitude or size of an earthquake, scientists used the Richter scale, developed by Charles Richter in 1934. This scale is based on a logarithmic increase of magnitude.
Yeah, I knew the Richter scale was how they reported the level.
No problem.
I thought the Geiger counter was like the actual little contraption.
What sound does a Geiger counter make?
Yeah, that's a good question.
It's Thor Siri.
Oh. All right. Sounds like popcorn.
I'm literally just making popcorn right now.
Okay. Anyway, we should move on. I just had to address that since I screw up all the time. And I'm sure somebody on YouTube was mean to me. I just don't even want to go look.
Oh, I'm going.
I don't want to know.
You continue reading and I'm going.
Go see if anyone left him. The YouTube listeners are the ones that call me out the most, which I don't mind being called out, really.
Well, considering our biggest YouTube listener is my 12-year-old daughter's best friend.
But he's never been the one.
No? I figured he would be the point of order. No.
He's not. He's not. He's always pretty cool. Okay. But along with the Joseph Bartle theory came the Friedrich Harman theory. Harman was a serial killer who was rampant in the 1920s, and he was said to be vampiric. Other than the fact that Harman happened to be active during this time, it doesn't really seem like people had much reason to suspect him or of Joseph Bartle for that matter.
For that matter. Matter.
Are you done?
It depends.
On what?
Whether or not I matter.
No. For that matter. Of actually carrying out this mass homicide. Harman was a serial killer, but he was known for targeting male prostitutes in the area, not as a family annihilator.
Does it really matter whose turn it is?
Yes.
A lot of people seem to believe that the murder seemed very personal, which we tend to agree with since it was so incredibly brutal, and strangulation is a very intimate method of murder. It doesn't sound like the killer went into this with the intention of doing the least amount of damage possible in order to take these people's lives. These people were beaten to the point of being almost unrecognizable, and then some strangled afterward. The fact that they were all covered up afterwards also suggests some level of guilt as well. One could also argue that the brutality of the murders was simply the result of the killer's choice of weapon. If you're using something heavy, an axe-like weapon, I can't imagine there's any way to keep a killing like that from being absolutely horrific. Ideally, one would think that the first blow was the one to have killed them. But if it was just the matter of it taking more blows by the killer for them to die, it may have just been a matter of callous necessity for the killer and not necessarily passion or anger that made him hit them so many times. I would tend to lean towards the sudden rush of anger.
I just feel like if I'm using a big ol' heavy, 30-pound axe, it's probably not going to be nice and neat.
Well, why would you choose such a weapon? Surely there were other weapons of opportunity.
Convenience? I don't know. I wasn't there, Sam.
He wanted to do this kind of damage if he chose that kind of weapon.
Well, you are the armchair detective.
And for the covering of the bodies, since the killer knew that he would be staying in the house for a while, he may have covered them up someplace so he didn't have to see them. But he wanted to look at the maid and the baby.
He covered them up too.
I know, but he didn't stash them.
Yeah, but you could probably shut the door.
I'm just gonna put a skirt over the
pretend it didn't happen.
She was in a chair, right? The maid?
Yeah, but he took her bed sheets and covered her up. She was like she had been sitting in the chair but had slid down off the chair when she got hit, and then he covered her up with a bed sheet. She was also dressed in daytime clothes, so there was a few of them that were, because in the picture it looked like Andreas Gruber was dressed in his work clothes, like overalls and a collar shirt.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell what the other ones were wearing. But then the maid, someone made a comment that she was dressed in her daytime clothes. It was almost like it didn't happen in the middle of the night. Like maybe it was during the day that this all happened too.
Perhaps.
Which I thought was weirder even.
But she would also be probably most likely one of the last people to get dressed into her night clothes because she would be continuing the cleaning.
No, because she hadn't even started work yet. She arrived there the night before and was supposed to start work the next day.
Oh, that makes me feel even more like she was one of the primary targets.
She was only there for like maybe 6 hours
Yeah.
before someone killed them all.
And the fact that she was left out on display makes me feel like she was probably one of the primary targets.
She wasn't left out on display. She was in her bedroom. And then she was sitting in her bedroom in a chair, and it looked like someone came in the door, walked up behind her while she was sitting, and smacked her in the head with the murder weapon. She slid down kind of onto the floor, but was still propped up on the chair, and then he covered her with a bed sheet and shut the door.
Okay.
That's what I understand. I didn't see it. There was no photo of that the way there was of a lot of the other stuff, but that's what the description said.
Okay. So, for the covering of the bodies, since the killer knew that he would be staying in the house for a while, he may have covered them up simply so that he didn't have to see them. Who knows? It's really hard to say what goes on in the mind of a person who could do something like this. Is it?
Unless you're saying.
Is it? It seems like it could go either way. Someone who was angry with the family and targeted them specifically, or it could be the matter of a cold, heartless serial killer or traveling vagrant who wanted an isolated place to stay for a while. The family dynamic seems to have rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and there were many reports of them being very unwelcoming and not personable at all. So it seems plausible that they could have made someone angry enough to do something like this. Maybe.
The supposed murder weapon was eventually found almost a year after the murders. An article written for the Munich Latest News on July 4th, 1923, stated that an item whose name I cannot even begin to pronounce was found above the stairway in a false ground on hay, and was probably hidden by the murderers.
How's it spelled?
It is spelled Reuthaue. I'll describe it. Photos of the tool can be found online, and it looks almost like a really big axe, but the head is shaped more like a pickaxe. It went on to state that traces of human blood and dried up hair were found on the iron parts of the tool and on the wooden handle. There had also been a pocket knife discovered nearby where the bodies had been found, and the prosecutor's office was asking for any information regarding the owner of the knife. Obviously, no one ever came forward with anything useful regarding the knife, and the big tool used in the killing was thought to have belonged to Andreas Gruber himself.
Was it like a farming tool?
Yeah, it's like It just looks like a big axe handle. It's really long. And then the head of it's as big as like an axe, the big metal head, except the end of it's pointy like a pickaxe. Like they say they're handmade tools that people use on farms. I've never seen one.
In 2007, the case was actually reopened, and investigators thought a fresh look and advanced technology might give the case a shot at being solved. They should have called me. It was determined that evidence was likely not properly collected at the beginning of the investigation, and tons of the evidence was actually still missing, including, dun dun dun, the heads of the victims. During World War II, the building where the victims' heads were kept was actually bombed, thus destroying all of that evidence, and after that, the Hinterkaifeck file was placed under the category unfinished, within the police department and the prosecutor's office. It was cold. A few years after the murder, all of the buildings on the Hinterkaifeck farm were demolished. Normally, there would be hundreds of photos of a crime scene like this to go through before the demolition. No one apparently thought that this was necessary because the only things that describe the actual layout and scale of the farm was one police photo and a sketch, which wasn't overly helpful to investigators who had never been there. Disappointing as it is, it was determined during this investigation that the case was very unlikely to ever see any resolution.
As quoted from an unknown writer in an article written in 1951 for the Swabian National newspaper.
Do you think the Nazis bombed the building to hide the evidence?
I don't know. I think that Augsburg was just bombed. I don't know if you know this about Germany, but it was heavily involved in World War II.
What?
Pretty well immersed.
I always wondered what WWII meant. I'm kidding, people. Geiger counter. I'm kidding.
Don't divert attention.
Abort.
This is a quote from the Swabian National newspaper. Quote, all had to be allowed to run again. The arrested craftsmen and those who, after the discovery of the murder, guarded the court on the orders of the police and who later fell under suspicion because no trace could be traced to the end. And the rumors are still going around today. The farmers then messed up their doors every evening for years and let the farm dogs off the chains. At the public prosecutor's office, the files piled up. Time and again, drilling was carried out, forecasts were made, motives and possible perpetrators were sought, and nothing came out. Nothing at all.
Today, a small memorial area can be found just down the street from where the Gruber farm once stood. It reads, quote, Memorial for Hinterkaifeck in the immediate vicinity of the crime. Godless hand. The family Gabriel-Gruber fell victim here on 31st March 1922. End quote.
And that's all we have for you this week on the Hinterkaifeck murders. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. We really appreciate you checking it out and hope you'll be back next week for another weird and creepy story, because we'll sure have one. We always do. Don't forget to subscribe to our show so you can be notified each week when we upload a new episode. And if you feel like taking the time to leave us a rating and a review, we would appreciate it a whole lot. This helps out the show a ton, and we love any feedback you guys choose to give us. Again, thank you so very much for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
Hey Siri, how do you say goodbye in German?
In German, goodbye is Auf Wiedersehen.
Duh.
Auf Wiedersehen. What do you mean, duh?
There was a whole song about it on The Sound of Music.
What song?
Auf Wiedersehen. Adieu. Goodbye.
Adieu. Yeah, I don't know.
To you and you and you.
And you and you. Duh.
And then Third Eye Blind covered it.
Right.
I wonder if they translated that song into German. I'd love to hear it.
Hey Siri. Auf Wiedersehen. Auf Wiedersehen. I don't new language well.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Come at me, bro.